It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Andrew Bowie, the Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, The Guardian's North of England editor Helen Pidd, and the editor of Reaction and Times columnist Ian Martin. Today, is Plan B and the booster campaign enough to deal with Omicron?
There are several things we don't know, but all the things that we do know are bad.
The hospitality industry is hit by cancellations. Should the government offer financial support?
It's still radio silence from the Chancellor.
We'll also be asking how we can start to live with COVID. Also today,
we have put an end to the criminalisation of people who are not criminals.
As Malta becomes the first EU country to legalise cannabis. We speak to the Conservative MP who says now is the time to change Britain's drugs laws. Well, just as we've come on air, I can bring you the breaking news that the Bank of England has raised interest rates for the first time in 3 years up to 0.25%. That follows yesterday's inflation figures, which surged to 5.1%. So let's open the programme with a question about whether that's the right response from the Bank of England. Andrew?
Yeah, hi, Jo. I think it is the right response. It's a proportionate and measured response. We need to do something to try and tackle this increase in inflation, the highest inflation rate since 2011. So I think it's sensible. What we don't want to see is racing inflation rates, racing interest rates going ever higher. So I think it's sensible, measured. The Bank of England needed to act, and they've done the right thing.
Have they done the right thing, Emily, or have they gone far enough?
I think what we need to understand is whether it is the sort of inflation that we had after the Second World War, you know, when the economy started again. So is this inflation that's caused by COVID, by there being difficulties with supply chains? Is this a temporary problem or is it more endemic as it was in the 1970s? I think whatever it is, it's likely to be global. And I think that it's something that we need to be working across the world on.
Has the Bank of England done the right thing?
Probably. I mean, the rate is not very high. The inflation is higher, but I think if we want to tackle it, then we do have to work internationally and we have to understand the nature of inflation. I know that Ian has a view that it isn't either of the two things. I've suggested something else again, but I think we do need to have a better understanding than we do at the moment. And we haven't talked about it for years because it's not been an issue.
Right. Helen, a reaction from you?
Well, I'd be lying if I said I truly understood the minutiae of fiscal policy. But what I do know is that we're facing a major cost of living crisis in the UK. I had an email yesterday saying my direct debit for my electric and gas is going up from £85 a month to £200 a month. So I think something had to be done. Whether this is the right thing, I will defer to bigger brains.
Ian?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, the authorities are in a really, really difficult position here because, as Emily said, they don't quite know what's causing this inflation. But I think it's broadly the right move. But their concern was if they raise interest rates, even by a small amount, that you then hit the recovery, which is already stalling. And if you look at Wall Street, I mean, the sort of big brains there are betting on a burst of inflation this year or next year, and then sharp deflation if the recovery stalls. So it's a really difficult call to make. I
mean, there were some calls for it to happen last time round the Bank of England made their decision, and they postponed it. And then people perhaps thought they wouldn't do it today because of Omicron. Are you surprised?
No, I thought they had to do something. I mean, just overnight, the warnings have come out of the US. The Fed is predicting, Fed policymakers are predicting 3 or 4 increases in the US next year. So essentially, the consensus view amongst central bankers and amongst the authorities is that they have underestimated the scale of this. In the last 6 months, are going to have to move quickly. So this is just the start.
And I suppose in historic context, it's still low, very low. We've had record low interest rates for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it is low, but I think it's the unravelling of a kind of 30-year process where central bankers knew the answers and knew what they were doing, and they've targeted inflation at 2%. They've now lost control of that. They've used QE to create this sort of this huge kind of pile of money printing, and it's now a very, very dangerous moment in the global economy.
Right, other breaking news in the last half hour or so. Let's show you this headline in terms of response to pre-Christmas planning. This in the Daily Mail. Queen cancels family pre-Christmas lunch for 50 people at Windsor Castle with regret as a precaution to try to save her loved one's festive plans. You may well have seen the Chief Medical Officer yesterday at the press conference at Downing Street, Chris Whitty, saying cut back on your plans over the Christmas period and prioritise your social events. Emily, have you cut back your plans?
Yeah, we had a staff dinner this week, which normally I would invite everybody who'd ever worked for me, and it tends to be a very large event. But we cut it back to just current staff and one other, I think.
Right, but it's still going ahead.
It went ahead, but we had it in a large room with a smaller number of people with the windows open, and we asked everybody to take a test before they arrived. And the idea was that if we kept it smaller, it was more manageable. You know, yeah, I mean, this is the best we could do, really. I mean, in the absence of any kind of clear guidance, you just have to fall back on what you think is the best thing to do.
Right, so people making their own decisions because there is a lack of clear guidance. Andrew, are you cutting back on your events, social events?
Well, I mean, I'm quite in the lucky position that our office Christmas dinner was a couple of weeks ago now, but I'd had very little planned for the next few weeks anyway, given we are supposed to be, fingers crossed, touch wood, flying across to Sweden to see family next week. But I
do you think that's going to happen?
Well, I very much hope so. And so I've taken the decision to get back to Aberdeenshire for the next few days so that I myself am minimising social contact. Otherwise, I've been in the studio with you today, Jo. So I think the Queen has taken the right decision. It's a sensible decision to take, not to engage in large gatherings like that until we know exactly how bad Omicron is, how serious it is, and whether the NHS can cope. I think all of us have to play our part in just making sure that we do what we can in a small way to stop or minimise the spread as much as we can.
Helen?
Well, yeah, I've cancelled pretty much all my social engagements. My sister-in-law was supposed to be getting married on Saturday for a big party. That's been cancelled. But what I'm trying to decide now, I'm supposed to be going to a funeral on Tuesday, and that feels like a really important thing. But so does Christmas with they won't like me saying this, but elderly parents. It's a really difficult choice to have to make. You know, should I miss out on paying my respects to my great uncle so that I can see my parents at Christmas? I just don't know what to do.
What about you, Ian? I mean, it's interesting. People are having to make these decisions themselves. The government is obviously, well, there isn't in terms of rules and restrictions about what you can do, but obviously the message from Chris Whitty was clear. Yeah,
I think they're relying on people making sensible choices. We're still hoping to get to Scotland if such a thing is still legal. I assume it will be. But I think, tens of millions of people will be making that calculation and understanding that it's about chains of transmission and that the choices that they make are then inherited by other people if they mix with them, so they have to be careful.
Right, there has been quite a bit of criticism, though, overnight and this morning to what Chris Whitty has said, because the Prime Minister didn't say cancel social events or Christmas parties. Let's listen to the Conservative MP Steve Brine.
And at a stroke, the Chief Medical Officer changed government policy and put this country, certainly hospitality, and Winchester's hospitality bears that out in what I'm hearing, into effective lockdown. So can I ask, yes or no, is what Professor Whitty said last night now the policy of this government, that we should socialise carefully? What in practical legal terms does that mean? And on support, because advisors are now running the show, I'll bet none of them run businesses facing complete ruin as a result of what was said last night. The Treasury is going to have to do more.
Are advisors running the show, Andrew?
I don't know if they are, but I think it's very important to listen to them, and they are the experts in their fields. And I think that we as citizens in this country need to listen to them and make judgments based on the advice that we're hearing. And therefore, I think that's why many of us have taken the decision to do just as Chris Whitty said, to limit our social interactions with people, to take reasonable steps to try and minimise the spread of this new variant until we know how serious it is and until we know the effect that it will have on our National Health Service. The Prime Minister is very much running the show, but it's very important that we do all listen to the advice that's coming from people like Chris Whitty and others.
Right, but has he effectively changed government policy, Chris Whitty?
I don't think he has. What he's said is he's given us his advice as a specialist in that field that we should minimise social contacts. And it's up to individuals, sensible individuals out there, make their minds up as to what exactly that means and whether or not they're going to follow that advice. And I would urge everybody to do so. I certainly am. I think everybody else on the show today is. So that we can stop the spread of this, or try and minimise anyway the spread of what seems to be a very, very easily spread variant of coronavirus.
Let me make the obvious point in a clear way. We have a Prime Minister whose job it is to lead. We have a Prime Minister who's supposed to be in charge. He's supposed to have sufficient authority that when he says something, people pay attention. But we actually have a Prime Minister who doesn't dare say whether we should be cutting back on our parties or not, because he knows that what will happen is that the media will simply play that bit of tape, and then play the bit of tape that he had from last year, and then play all the accusations about illegal parties happening at Number 10. And so he is not in a position, he doesn't have the authority to be able to tell the country at the time of crisis like this what it is that we should be doing. And so we have to rely on Chris Whitty, who, yes, or in this issue has stepped up and become Prime Minister for a day.
Oh, Andrew?
The Chris Whitty, no, he's not become Prime Minister for a day. He's the Prime Minister's senior advisor on this issue.
You have just told us to listen to him because the Prime Minister has
that,
nothing to say on the issue. The Prime Minister says, we don't need to worry about it.
Emily, I wouldn't, far be it from me to accuse you of putting words in my mouth, but that's not what I said. Chris Whitty was standing on the podium yesterday alongside the Prime Minister, and he gave us his best advice, as he thought, as to how we should conduct our lives over the next few weeks. And I think it's very sensible for us to listen to him. And
the Prime Minister couldn't even say, I agree. The Prime Minister had to say, oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. What kind of leadership is that?
Again, I think you're putting words in his mouth. I think by going on that podium with Chris Whitty yesterday evening, he was showing the leadership that is required. And I think we should not prejudge any of the investigations that are going on to anything else, and maybe focus on what we should all be doing right now, which is following Chris Whitty's advice, minimising social contact and doing what we can to stop the spread of Omicron.
But Ian, is it true that the authority of the Prime Minister, as Emily said, has taken such a battering that actually, not just in the vein of what was happening or not last year at Downing Street, but amongst his own MPs, he couldn't introduce restrictions or legal rules?
Yeah, I think on the question of Whitty, etc., I think it's really difficult because of what the government did last year, which is highly unusual. It was an unusual situation. They essentially put the advisors front and centre in terms of presenting to the public. That's very different from a wartime scenario where you tend not to hear from generals. It's elected politicians who do that for a reason, because there are disputes between advisors and politicians always in a crisis. So they're now paying the price for that because we as a public all want to see Chris Whitty and what he has to say. However, on the politics of it, I think the situation is actually even worse for Boris Johnson than people think. He now depends for the central measure, to get through the central measures of his administration on COVID, he depends and relies on the Labour Party. That's a huge shift that has happened this week.
Helen, just before we move on, how do you see it in terms of Boris Johnson versus the scientists?
Well, I know who I would trust, and poll after poll shows that the general public are going to believe the scientists. And I just think you can't hold a prime-time press conference and wheel out these trusted experts and expect the population not to follow them. And I think we're going to talk about this later, I think, but then to fail to provide any business support when you're saying to people, basically, don't go to pubs and restaurants, is a massive dereliction of duty and really unforgivable. And it's going to push hundreds of thousands of people into poverty, people who won't be getting shifts at these bars and restaurants over Christmas, and puts loads of businesses in peril. So I think it's deeply irresponsible what the government's doing.
One of the headlines from last night's press conference were the numbers. 78,610 new COVID cases yesterday. That's the highest number since the pandemic began. We're showing you those case numbers rising. You can just see the 7-day average there at the end. Nearly 56,000. Let's speak to Dr. Duncan Robertson. He's in Oxford. Duncan, how bad are the numbers that we're seeing?
Well, I think, we're looking in the rearview mirror. These 78,000 cases aren't the number of people who are infected. And of course, those Wednesday figures, most of those were swabbed on Monday, had PCR tests on Monday. So they're likely to be infected last week. And what we're seeing with Omicron is it's doubling roughly every 2 days. So this is really, huge growth, particularly in London. And I think, we have to realise it was only 3 weeks ago that the world actually started to know about Omicron, and now, it's dominant in London. So it's a huge problem.
You said, as have many others in your field, that the numbers are sort of doubling every 2, perhaps to 3 days. Does that mean we might see and might reach the peak quite quickly?
Well, certainly it depends what you mean by reaching the peak, because one of the issues we're going to find is that actually we run out of capacity for PCR tests. So if we just look at cases, then perhaps that's going to flatten off, whereas actually the number of infections still starts to rise. The other thing is we, of course, have 2 things going on. We have a Delta epidemic, which is roughly constant, probably falling a bit now. And we have this kind of exponential explosion of Omicron. So it's taken some time to get these real signals. Yes, we are probably going to get a very focused number of cases, but I think the thing to say about that is it won't just all be over in a week. It will still take weeks and months of large case numbers, so it'll come down relatively slowly.
Right. I mean, we're still waiting for that all-important data about the severity of the Omicron variant, because we've talked about how transmissible it is. But even if it is milder, because of the sheer numbers, could it still put pressure on the NHS in a way that might overwhelm it?
Absolutely. I think that's becoming more and more likely as we go on. So you can sort of wait for all the data to come in. But we do know 3 out of the 3 things. We know that it's extremely transmissible. We know that you can get reinfected. And the other thing to say about cases is currently it excludes people who are reinfected, who've had it before. That may change soon. And we know that also people who've had vaccines have a limited protection. So boosters are very important, but the rate of booster rollout isn't going to control the peak. And in terms of whether it'll overwhelm the NHS, that really defines how you define it overwhelming the NHS. So if you kind of say the NHS can never be overwhelmed, then it won't be overwhelmed.
And what's your response then to the Prime Minister saying yesterday Plan B and the vaccine programme is what we're going to work with at the moment in terms of restrictions?
Well, with all these things, I think we've seen it with Alpha, we've seen it with Delta. You can either be proactive and do things and hopefully reduce things so that increases the likelihood, for example, of schools opening normally in January, or having NHS and critical staff being able to come in, because of course if they all get infected at once, that's going to cause huge problems. So really, it depends what you think, but there's a real risk coming in the next few months.
Dr. Duncan Robertson there. Thank you very much for joining us. You mentioned schools, Duncan. Let's just show everybody this in Wales online. Start of school term in January delayed in Wales amid Omicron fears. That is the Labour government there in Wales. Is that the right response already before we know about the severity of Omicron, Emily?
I think that's a little bit... I mean, I read the article, and what's happened is that school opening has been delayed by 2 days, and what they've said is they want the staff to use that to plan for there being extra tests, making sure that they do have staggered opening, lots of other measures that they're hoping that can be introduced in Wales, but do need time to plan for, and it's in order to ensure that the schools are open.
Right, so you think it's the right thing to do already to be saying we're going to delay opening possibly up to January the 10th, and for preparations for online learning?
Well, no school is allowed to open later than January the 10th, but they've said that they want them to open late, 2 days later, in order to organise themselves. I think that's better than, listen, I mean, I have a brother who's a teacher, and they were told kind of a couple of days before this time last year, you've got to do all these measures, and how were they ever going to do it if they hadn't had a chance to plan it?
Right, so would you recommend something like that now being issued as guidance here?
I think if they want the schools to do something different, they need to give the staff the time to be able to do it properly. But I tell you what, we do not want our schools closing. What we need to do is, if they need to have a couple of days in order to make sure that they're properly organised and make sure that they're robust and can remain open, then that is a price that should be paid.
Sensible precaution by Wales?
No, I think actually we have to wait and see. And the advantage in this wave is that we're going to know relatively soon. I think the entire country is praying that it's mild, and the UK is a bit of a laboratory here for the rest of the world. We will know in about 10 days' time, and hopefully it's milder.
Yeah, but sorry, if we know in 10 days' time, then how many days are you giving the staff to be able to tape off different areas to tell the kids to come in at different times?
Understood.
There are practical problems.
Understood.
Understood.
It's incredibly difficult, but also we've learnt in the last 2 years, and I think the government is trying to, I think it's in a weak position politically, but is trying to find a middle ground. We know that all of these restrictions, the harsher restrictions, impose enormous social costs, particularly on the poor and the deprived. So I think jumping the gun and going too early with more restrictions would be a mistake.
Is it jumping the gun, Helen?
I think possibly. I think closing schools should always be the last resort. If it really is just 2 days, and that 2 days will make a massive difference in terms of reducing infection, then maybe it's worth it. But I'm sceptical at this stage because I think that children have missed out on so much and they deserve to have full education.
I mean, is it a sensible precaution to take now, Andrew, so that schools do have a chance to get everything organised before children come back into school in January? A lot more testing, which is probably going to happen anyway, prepare those online lessons again and make sure everybody is fit and healthy to come back in.
I think it's very sensible for schools to prepare for what they might need to face
by delaying for a few days.
But I would caution anybody to start talking about the delay of reopening of schools. I was very pleased to hear the First Minister of Scotland say that they were going to do everything they could to ensure that schools were not closed any longer than was originally planned over the Christmas period. I think what we saw last year when the schools closed was a widening of the attainment gap. We saw vulnerable children fall even further behind, some very at-risk children put in terrible positions that weren't picked up on simply because they were not in a school environment for many weeks of the year last year. So I think closing schools should be the very last thing that any government on these islands should be thinking about doing right now. But preparing for what schools might have to face in the new year, I think is a sensible move to take.
Right, well, let's talk about businesses, because we saw those pictures of empty restaurant there at the beginning of the programme. We've all talked about plans being cancelled. Rachel Reeves for Labour, the Shadow Chancellor, has said the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, must come out of hiding. It is time the government came forward with their plan so our great British businesses and their workers have the clarity and support they need to weather this storm. Andrew, how long can you expect businesses to take probably catastrophic losses over Christmas, which is the busiest time of the year, when everyone is cancelling their plans, and not provide support?
Well, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, far from being in hiding, is in talks with leaders in the hospitality sector today. I was talking to leaders in the hospitality sector in my part of the world.
He's back. I think he's coming back, or he's on his way back. But anyway, yeah, go on, Andrew.
Well, I think the idea that in this day and age you can't communicate with people in the UK from the USA, where he's doing some incredibly important work on behalf of the government, is for the birds. He's talking to those hospitality leaders. And as the government has proven since day one of this pandemic, with the furlough scheme, with the bounce back loans, with the investment, the cut in VAT.
Yeah, so is he going to introduce
£6 billion extra to devolved authorities to help them through the last couple of years?
Right.
I think we've proven that we will step in when required. As I said, the Chancellor's talking to those businesses affected, possibly right now.
As and when required.
Well, I do think that by the end of the day, that's British time, not Californian time, we need to have a proper offer made to these struggling businesses, many of whom have closed in hospitality, we all know, and those that have survived have been looking to the Christmas period as being the time when they at long last might be able to kind of make themselves more viable.
What would that offer look like if you were devising it?
I think there's a number of things that we've been arguing for a long time, obviously, which is small business rates. We need to make sure we've got that. We need to make sure that we have proper sick pay. But I think there's more that could be done. I think the Treasury needs to be much more on its toes and much more flexible. Whether that's kind of, have it doing focus grants, focus loans on particular businesses because of particular problems or particular sectors, or whether it's, putting off paying taxes for a bit further so that people have more time to pay. I mean, these are all things that, frankly, should be being discussed. I would suggest with the Chancellor, or we've also got Kwasi Kwarteng, one of the two, don't know where he is, maybe he's in another country. But, it would be nice if they were there talking to business, getting ideas from them, so that, business had some kind of idea as to what the future holds for them and the support there should be.
Andrew?
May I just say, because what we have always said is that public health and economic support always go hand in hand. We've always needed the two of them to go together. And what we have instead is we have the Prime Minister giving his job over to Mr Whitty for the day, and absolutely no economic support on the back of it.
Andrew?
Well, this is interesting, isn't it, to hear Emily talk about what we should be doing instead. Is usually following up very closely behind what the British government is doing is the Labour Party's plan. This is what we should have done. Look, we are continually talking to business. The Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng is talking to business. I know, for example, Paul Scully, was the small business minister, was talking to pubs and landlords. Pub owners and landlords just yesterday evening to talk about what the government can do to support them through what is going to be a torrid few weeks. And so the idea that we're not talking to those people affected is simply not credible.
What's the plan? What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Well, the discussions are ongoing right now, Emily. I mean, for goodness sake, the Rishi Sunak's in discussions with the leaders of the hospitality sector right now.
When he gets off the plane, what's he going to announce?
Very rich for once to hear Labour calling for what our plan and what we're going to do. What would Labour do if you were in the same position?
I've just told you.
Now?
I've just told you. So
no, you didn't. You said no, Emily. You said some sort of focused grant scheme. I mean, that's not exactly very clear.
Hey, that's a start. Are you going to do that? So are you going to do that?
Okay.
You're going to start thinking about focus grants.
Don't talk over each other.
What is some sort of focus grant scheme then?
Well, all right. Let me put it to you, Andrew. Should there be now targeted furlough? Should there be targeted furlough support for certain industries? Let's take the hospitality industry, for pubs and bars and restaurants.
Look, all I know is that the Treasury keep every option open and available to them, as we've proven throughout the last 2 years. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer is in discussions as we speak with leaders of the hospital.
Helen.
The Business Secretary is talking to the wider business community, and everybody involved in government at every level will do what we can to support British business through what might well be a very difficult few weeks, as we have done since the beginning of this pandemic.
Helen, the government has said that it was one of the most generous schemes, the furlough scheme, to help businesses, employers and employees through the pandemic. Is that what you would want to see now or expect?
Yeah, I think so, because it's not going to last forever, is it? I think we're in a very because of the Christmas period. If it wasn't for Christmas, let me say this, if it wasn't for Christmas, I'd still be going out. I wouldn't have cancelled the Guardian Manchester Christmas party because I wouldn't be seeing my elderly relatives. So I don't think we're going to have the same problem in the new year, even if Omicron rates are still very high. So I think if it's just a question of stopping businesses going to the wall in the next, over the next month, and to save, many people from potentially going into destitution if they work in hospitality industries and are suddenly having their 0 hours shifts cancelled. If it's a question of keeping those businesses above water and the workers' heads above water, then I think it's worth it, because we're not really looking at the same situation before, which could be months and months and months of the furlough scheme, in my opinion.
Ian?
He's going to have to move, I think. But what's most interesting about this, I think, and this shows how much has changed since the Labour reshuffle, is it is just fascinating to watch Labour playing politics again properly, back aiming at the mainstream, getting ahead of where the Tories are. You saw that statement there for Rachel Reeves. That's sort of classic kind of New Labour attack messaging of getting in on something that Sunak is already planning and making it look as though he's in hiding when he's not. He's flying back.
And Labour will be able to say that was pressure from us that got you
precisely. And now Boris Johnson said this week, he keeps using this ridiculous phrase that Labour is playing politics. So Boris Johnson has never played politics. But after the calamity of the last 6 years, it seems that Labour, or that the Tories, can no longer rely on Labour not doing this sort of basic political stuff and harrying them. It's I think one of the most significant developments of the last few weeks.
And what would you suggest Rishi Sunak does then? Because he'll be reluctant, won't he, to reopen a furlough scheme?
Really reluctant because it's incredibly complex, and as Helen said, it may only be required for 2-3 weeks, but the pain being suffered by people in hospitality is obviously very real. So they're going to have to botch together some sort of temporary scheme which they can then review again in mid-January, I would have thought. All
right, before we move on, let's just show you this tweet from the BBC's Europe editor, Katia Adler. You may be aware of the news. France says it's introducing new restrictions on travellers from the UK and not residents in France, to slow the spread of Omicron variant. From Saturday, only those with a compelling reason will be allowed into France. Even vaccinated travellers will have to isolate. Proportionate response there, Ian, from France?
I can understand why it's happening, and Britain is in the forefront of this Omicron thing at the moment, but I don't really... Listening to the scientists, I doubt that it will make any difference. There'll be lots of French citizens or Swedish citizens or German citizens who've been in London in the last week or so and are now going back to these countries for Christmas. It's happening, and it's doubling so fast that I don't think restrictions will make much of a difference.
I think it's obviously up to each country what it is that they do to defend themselves against this. But we all know that it's now everywhere. And I don't think that closing the borders in this way is necessarily the right decision. I think what they should be doing is getting out there and making sure that their population is vaccinated.
Just before, as I say, we move on, there's one more thing I wanted to ask. Helen, the Prime Minister said he wanted a national conversation about how this country might live with COVID. His comments at the time were widely interpreted as perhaps a nod towards mandatory vaccinations, which was dismissed and rejected. What do you think he meant, though, about a national conversation about how to avoid going in and out of semi-lockdown and living with COVID?
I think he was avoiding the question and avoiding having to make a big, tough decision. And we know that at every turn, when things get tough, he delays, he waffles, and then eventually he's sort of forced to make a difficult decision. So I think by talking about a national conversation, I mean, what is that? It's completely meaningless.
Andrew?
I don't know if it's meaningless. I think we do need to have that national conversation about living with COVID. COVID is now with us. It will be with us forever. But what we've got to do right now is focus on, as Emily says, getting as many people vaccinated, not just in this country, but around the continent of Europe and indeed the world. And, 656,000 people yesterday got their booster jabs. 80% of all elderly and vulnerable people with their 3 doses. That's a huge step forward. But the Prime Minister was right. COVID is with us. So we do, at some stage, need to have that conversation about how we are going to live with this virus as we move forward, because we can't keep lurching in and out of lockdowns or in and out of restrictions. As we've just been speaking about, it's very, very harmful to huge swathes of different sectors across the country.
We're going to talk about drugs policy. We're joined by the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt, who launched the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group and has a major report out tomorrow. Welcome to you. Crispin, your report has some research on MPs' attitudes to drug reform. What have you found out? Give us a preview of what's in the report.
Well, I think it's very good news in as much as MPs, strange enough, reflect the views of most of the rest of the population, is that our drugs policy isn't working. It is not properly based on evidence. And I think it signals to the government that they have considerably more room for manoeuvre than they might think in considering how to reframe drugs policy. 61% of Conservative MPs agree with the statement if we're to improve the way we tackle the problems caused by controlled drugs, we need to change how we make drug policy. Now, in your introduction, you said I wanted to change the laws. The first thing to do is to change the analysis and to create the basis on which we can change the laws by having a proper consideration of the evidence and a proper research capacity.
Right, OK, well, you've raised that issue. I mean, are you personally talking about liberalisation or just reform within the remit that you have sort of set yourself? I mean, would MPs or even you like to see legalisation of cannabis like we've seen in Malta, for example, or something like decriminalisation?
Well, the government is very clear that it's not going to decriminalise or legalise adult use recreational cannabis. But we are going to see a significant number of examples. We've already got 13 American states, we've got Canada, we've got Uruguay. As you said, we've now got Malta. And it looks as though we might get Germany in the next year or two once they design how they intend to do it. And it's there that the key evidence and data can be collected. All these countries are doing a fantastic service to us because it is the regulations and the licensing conditions that will determine whether or not you're going to maximise the reduction of public harm and the maximisation of the public benefit if you choose to go down a legalisation route. All right, it's how you do it that's correct that is important.
Right, well, stay with us because we've got obviously 2 other MPs here. Andrew, have you got an appetite for real reform to drugs policy?
I think where Crispin is right is that we need to reform of how we conduct the analysis, and it will be very interesting to see the data coming from Malta as we examine the data coming from states in America, Canada, Uruguay that have already decriminalised cannabis for recreational use. I personally am not convinced right now that that's the road that the UK should be going down. I think there's still huge questions over psychosis and cognitive dissonance effects on that, and we need to see whether legalization actually leads to more frequent use, which could be damaging to society as a whole. However, I'm open to looking at the evidence and taking evidence-based approach on changing drugs policy in this country. It's quite clear the policies that we have right now are not working, and so we need to do something, but I'm not convinced the legalization of cannabis yet is the way that we need to go.
Andrew's not convinced. What about you, Emily?
No, I mean, I keep an open mind on this. I do listen to the evidence. And actually I changed my mind from being somebody who was in favour of legalisation to really not thinking it was a good idea when I became an MP. Well, because the cannabis itself has changed, it's much stronger. And then I heard from constituents about what was happening on the ground. It isn't some sort of utopian kind of, fluffy drug quite often. It's actually its effects can be very serious, and it can have quite grave social effects. I heard from an old lady who, for example, who wasn't going to go down in her lift to get out of her block of flats because there was always a gang of boys there and she was frightened of them. They were bound very closely together. They spent their time smoking. But listen, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be looking at evidence, and I welcome the fact that the London Mayor has got an inquiry going into it. So let's keep an open mind on it, but let's also be realistic about what it is that we're talking about. And cannabis is now much stronger than it used to be. Now, if we're going to legalise it and we're going to regulate it, then how would we regulate it and make sure that it wasn't any of the stronger stuff that came out? And how do we make sure that that's illegal and the gentler stuff is not?
Crispin.
I mean, all of these questions need some answers.
Crispin?
And Emily is right there. The reason why we have such a level of psychosis in the young from cannabis in the UK is it is criminally supplied and it's made super strong. And if you are inclined to have a mind vulnerable to psychosis, then it's going to trigger it. And of course, it is sold to children. And children find it much easier to get this very strong cannabis than they do alcohol, because alcohol is now almost entirely a legal business. And people know what the products are, and the products have to be sold through licensed premises, and they'll lose their business if they sell to children. And so the Canadian case for legalisation did rest on protecting children and reducing crime. And that's why we need to advance on this, a proper examination. All the evidence is now going to become available to us from a whole bunch of different jurisdictions around the world. And the overall object must be to reduce the harm to the public. And at the moment, we have policies that create the harm and they line up the criminals with the users to the detriment of all.
All right, I'll come back to you more broadly on the drug strategy. But Helen, listening to that and what Andrew and Emily have said, do you think regulation would protect enough against the very strong substances of cannabis and the impact on children and their access to it?
It's hard to say. I mean, my mum was a psychiatrist and she successfully scared me off smoking weed by telling me about the psychosis among her, particularly male patients, actually. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence which shows that smoking tobacco and alcohol has far higher mortality risk, and we let people do that. But I do think actually at the moment there's already effectively tolerance for smoking cannabis. I looked through the court list this morning, the Magistrates Court in Manchester, to see if anybody was actually up on charges of cannabis possession, and those that were, it was like the most minor charge on the charge sheet. They were up for much more serious offences, whether that was dealing, heroin, Class A offences. So I think it's already tolerated in society. It's just whether the government has got the appetite for showing some bravery, really, and a bit of bold political leadership in saying it's not working, instead of suggesting that the solution is taking people's passports off each other if they're found to have done a line of coke at a dinner party or whatever.
Crispin, is the appetite really there? Is the groundwork being laid in the drug strategy that we've had from the government?
Part of it is. The half of the strategy that's aimed at treatment, which reflects the work done by Dame Carol Black, is really excellent. There's a great deal more money going into treatment services, the money having gone out over the last decade or so. And so far as one can tell, that money is going to be reasonably ring-fenced. It's going to be very difficult for the government not to have that money follow the treatment services. That part of the policy has been then enveloped in this language about middle-class drug users who will tend to be non-problematic, are the ones who are not then going to end up needing these treatment services, and they're the ones who are not really being supplied by county lines in the way that has been suggested.
All right. Well, let me put. Yeah, but
can I just say, I just don't think that's right. Crispin, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Crispin says quite often, but there's a load of nonsense. You can't make a class distinction when it comes to the effect of drugs on people. You're really saying that the effect on the middle classes is much milder than it is on working class people?
No.
All right. Well, then I misunderstood you.
I mean, the difference I would draw is between problematic and non-problematic drug users. And by and large, we will find problematic drug users are the 10% of users and this pattern repeats itself for very many different types of drugs, including legal ones like alcohol, where people will use the drug to mask and treat some other pain in their life.
All right, well, hang on, because I want to get to Ian, because I'm not sure how you could make a separate category or certainly legislate for it in that sense. But broadly, Ian, I mean, do you think there is government appetite to change this? I mean, Andrew and Emily both have reservations about anything to do with legalising cannabis, but it's interesting what Helen said about the tolerance being there. Is that far enough to just treat it in a slightly different way, perhaps not criminalise everyone, and you treat it in the way Scotland has tried to with a health approach?
Possibly. I mean, I shared Emily's concern and Andrew's concern about strength and things being very different from 30, 40 years ago. But I would be cautiously in favour of reform on the basis that the current policy clearly isn't working. And there's also something globally which is happening, which is that you've got a medicinal cannabis-based industry developing very fast, and it's a huge opportunity. And as long as that's properly regulated, interesting things are happening there. And then you can start to see internationally the spread of this move towards legalisation or decriminalisation. So I just think that the drift of policy is going to require some sort of really serious, balanced look at the evidence, and it's going to over the next 5 to 10 years. But I'm cautiously in favour of reform.
Crispin, we've run out of time, Crispin, but so I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. But thank you very much for joining us and talking to us about the drugs policy, because I want to ask everybody, perhaps difficult after all the information that we have just had on the programme, how optimistic and pessimistic you are for 2022 and coming out of this pandemic. Emily?
I'm always an optimist, but I have to say, I do remember this time last year saying, we've just got to get through this dreadful Christmas and we won't have to have another one like it. And look where we are again. I mean, that's my concern, is getting in front of this virus, making sure that we can, start putting together our lives again and learn from it and make a better society as a result. We should have different priorities now. Different people are important, and just build on that, I think.
Briefly, Andrew, optimistic or not for 2022?
I'm a Scottish Conservative and an Aberdeen fan, so of course I'm the eternal optimist. And I do think that next year will be better than this if we continue with this great booster campaign and then focus on rebuilding this country after what has been an awful 2 years. I think 2022 can be a really good year, but after 4.5 years in politics and everything that we've been through since June 2017, I'm not going to make any predictions about what might be about to happen
Probably
next.
Wise. Helen?
And I kind of wish I was a bear and then I could just hibernate, go to sleep and wake up when it's all better. I take a little bit of heart from what Chris Whitty was saying about the development of vaccines, and that there's a real prospect to the development of a super duper vaccine which can banish all of the different variants. But then I think he said today that that's 18 months off. So that doesn't make me feel too optimistic. So the hibernation option does look effective.
Apart from inflation, war with Russia, China, apart from all of that, I'm really upbeat.
Oh, well, I'm really glad to hear it. What a way to end the programme. That's all we've got time for. We've got Politics UK tomorrow, but otherwise have a really wonderful Christmas. Bye-bye.